Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Well, good morning. This is it. Today we publish a landmark plan that provides a clear pathway to cutting the pollution that we put into the atmosphere, that creates jobs, improves lives and livelihoods, and unlocks new investment. 4.5 years ago, we got to work on what would quickly become the largest government program of work to cut emissions that we have ever seen. Embedding this work in a single framework that would require every single future government to take action to cut emissions was the job of the Zero Carbon Act. It is that legislation that conceived of the plan that we're announcing today. Exactly 3 years ago this month, the Zero Carbon Act had its first reading in Parliament. And speaking in the House then, I said that the challenge of cutting emissions would provide the best opportunity that we had to make our communities better. The emissions reduction plan that we're announcing today will do that. This is a blueprint for a low-carbon Aotearoa that will create well-paying jobs, upgrade the country to run on more clean energy, support nature and improve infrastructure. Together, the more than 300 actions that are contained within this plan and the several $billion of investment that it is backed up with add to a future that we can be proud of. The end of coal, that most harmful of fuels that we have used since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, gone for good. Kids walking or cycling to schools powered by clean energy. Fast and frequent and convenient buses and trains like New Zealanders deserve. More people getting around in electric vehicles. Families raising their kids in warmer, drier, healthier homes, and the savings showing up in their power bills every month. Aotearoa New Zealand's first emissions reduction plan puts us on a path to meet our long-term targets to 2050 in line with that 1.5 degrees temperature threshold. It builds on the progress that this government has made over 4.5 years and responds to the recommendations of He Poarangi, the Climate Change Commission. But of course, it's not job done. A plan alone will not cut emissions. It will take changes, both large and small, that together add up to a better, a cleaner future. And that is what the emissions reduction plan will do. Our emissions reduction strategy is based on 5 principles. First, it starts with what we need to do to play our part in the worldwide effort to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, so that current and future generations are protected from the floods and fires and droughts and storms of a changing climate. Second, that then flows into our Te Tiriti o Waitangi commitments and empowering Māori to respond to the particular risks and opportunities for Māori and the Māori economy, alongside, third, an equitable transition that brings everyone with us and leaves no one behind, and working with nature to solve the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis together. Those considerations then drive the ultimate outcome, which is a productive, sustainable, and inclusive economy that works for everyone. This map shows how those principles inform our strategy. You can find the full version of the strategy map in the first few pages of the executive summary of the emissions reduction plan. The full version of the map also points you to the individual chapters of the emissions reduction plan so that you can see how we have structured that plan to give effect to the strategy, which in itself, of course, flows from those principles. The whole strategy starts with what we need to do to play our part in the global effort to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. We will do this by meeting our 2050 targets set out in the Climate Change Response Act and through our nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. Our best scientists have told us what we need to do, and this plan will make it happen. In total, there will be 6 emissions budgets and emissions reductions plans to take us to 2050. Each budget will act as a stepping stone towards lower emissions, and each plan will include the necessary policies and strategies to meet that budget. Our first emissions budget requires us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by a further 11.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent over the course of the next 4 years. To ensure that the transition for Māori is inclusive, fair and equitable, the plan outlines how we intend for Māori and the government to work together in partnership to develop a new platform for Māori climate action, to develop a new Māori climate strategy and action plan, and to provide funding and resources for community action, kaupapa Māori and tangata Māori actions and solutions. For example, the plan includes specialist support for whenua Māori entities, farmers and growers, and we are continuing to support marae to upgrade to install clean energy like solar through the Māori and Public Housing Renewable Energy Fund. Now, if we work to ensure that the opportunities of the transition are available to everyone, that is our best route towards long-term success. We will not succeed if the transition further entrenches existing inequalities in our society and in our economy. To this end, the government will develop an equitable transition strategy, including proactive transition planning with Māori and other communities most affected by the transition, measures to support workers to transition to low-emission sectors and avoid job losses with unions and businesses, and actions to support households and communities to benefit from the transition. That's why, for example, the plan builds on the success of the Clean Car Discount with new approaches to making low-emission vehicles affordable and accessible for everybody. The protection and restoration of our forests, the renewal of our wetlands, and the protection of our endangered species are all urgent and critical in and of themselves. But those things also provide solutions to the climate crisis. The climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are inextricably linked and have the same root cause. The climate crisis is caused in part by the destruction of the world's wildernesses. So, for example, we will prioritise nature-based solutions as part of the emissions reduction plan reporting and establish an integrated work program that delivers climate, biodiversity and wider environmental outcomes. The plan includes support for Indigenous afforestation and commitments to include natural infrastructure, like wetlands, in our planning. So you can see how the first four principles both drive and shape the final outcome, which is an economy that is much more productive, much more sustainable, and much more inclusive than the one that we have today. Much more productive in the sense that the challenge of continuing to develop our economy whilst also dramatically cutting our emissions should be the single biggest driver imaginable of innovation and creativity, clean tech businesses, higher paying jobs, and more resilient supply chains. More sustainable in the sense that the protection and restoration of our natural world will be at the heart of our work to develop a climate-friendly economy. More inclusive in the sense that the transition takes everyone with us, leaves no one behind, and where Māori are empowered to manage the risks and take advantages of the transition for Māori and the Māori economy. To make that happen, we need to make sure that our overall system settings support those outcomes right across the economy, and that we work with our sectors and our industries to support them to both cut emissions and to find new opportunities. System settings are those whole-of-economy tools of pricing, regulation, policies and investment that support change and drive the overall transition. A balanced mix of system settings will lead to more investment in key areas like renewable energy. They'll drive innovation and nurture emerging technologies and industries. In terms of the emissions reduction plan, this means using emissions pricing to provide the right incentives for businesses, including in agriculture, to cut pollution and to invest in clean tech alternatives. Greening the financial system and investment markets so that capital flows naturally towards low carbon investment and away from higher pollution industries. Getting New Zealand's planning and infrastructure systems and processes into shape to accelerate the transition in our cities and our towns and our industries. Reshaping the research and science and innovation system to drive transformative change in some of the most difficult and challenging parts of the economy, and developing strategies to make greater use of our existing resources and replace non-renewable resources with renewables wherever possible. Getting our economic system settings right will support climate action in every part of the economy. But we also need to work with our key emissions-intensive industries and sectors to support them to both cut emissions and to find new opportunities. This means making it cheaper and easier to access electric vehicles, decarbonising heavy freight and supporting people to walk or cycle or take public transport, phasing out fossil fuels and massively ramping up investment in renewables, in transport, in electricity generation and in industry, lifting the quality of both home and commercial construction and the use of sustainable, low-carbon building materials, accelerating the rollout of practices and technology and tools for cutting emissions on farms and in agricultural businesses, increasing the supply of woody biomass to replace coal and other high-carbon fuels and materials, and encouraging native forests to act as long-term carbon sinks, cutting the amount of waste going to landfills, including food waste, and investing in waste infrastructure and landfill gas capture, and requiring refrigerants to be captured and destroyed when heating and cooling systems reach their end of life. The first emissions reduction plan lays the groundwork for a wide-ranging transition over many years. We are not aware of any other initiative other than the budget itself which draws in such a large span of government. And I do want to take this moment in particular to thank the Prime Minister, and I'm very sorry that she wasn't able to be with us today, the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, other ministers and agencies for their leadership and their commitment, because we would not be here today without that leadership and without that commitment. It has taken a tremendous effort. Endless briefings and reports and papers and a frankly gargantuan amount of work from countless officials. And having said that, the plan won't implement itself. Therefore, the Prime Minister will chair the Climate Emergency Response Group of Ministers who have overall governance and oversight of the emissions budgets and the plan. The existing ad hoc Climate Change Chief Executives Board has been formalised into an interdepartmental executive board under the Public Service Act 2020 and will report up to the Climate Emergency Response Group of Ministers. Ministers and Chief Executives will have individual responsibility for their part of the plan, but also collective responsibility for achieving the overall emissions budgets. And the Independent Climate Change Commission will monitor progress on an annual basis and report publicly. We are treating the declaration of a climate emergency with the gravity that it requires, and we are setting up the mechanisms to ensure that our response to it succeeds. The first emissions reduction plan will mean that more New Zealanders will be supported to purchase electric vehicles so that zero-emission vehicles make up at least 30% of the light fleet by 2035. That the amount of waste going to landfills will be reduced and most households will have curbside food recycling by 2030. There will be faster, more convenient, cheaper public transport, including major infrastructure projects in Auckland and Wellington and Christchurch, and nationally integrated ticketing. From 2025, only zero-emission buses will enter the fleet, and by 2035, the entire public transport fleet will be decarbonised. Low-emissions trucks will carry food and goods and cut freight emissions by 35% by 2035. Most of our biggest businesses will be powered by clean, renewable energy generated here in New Zealand and not extracted from overseas. We will end our reliance on coal with a ban on new low to medium temperature coal boilers and phase out all existing ones by 2037 at the latest. And there will be a price on agricultural emissions in place by 2025, and farmers and growers will be supported to reduce emissions with proven practices, tools and technology, and our native wildlife and forests will be restored and protected. Meeting our emissions budgets will require all of us to work together to make immediate reductions where we can and to lay the foundations for a more productive, a more sustainable, and a more inclusive future. The transition is going to require us to take significant change. This is going to take all of us, and it is going to take everything that we've got. But with this change comes an opportunity to improve well-being, become more productive, increase resilience, lower the cost of living, and rectify generations of inequality. Tackling climate change is truly a once-in-a-generation opportunity to build a future that's more equitable, more prosperous, and more innovative, and all within planetary limits. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.